So, right, there we are. Right,
Ah,
recording is being recorded. Yeah.
and Joe, that is why we love you with this high tech kind of double visibility fail-safe mechanism. So look, delighted to see everyone here, and thanks, Joe, for that prescient catch at the outset. They say to err is human, but to really follow up, you need a good Zoom facility that isn't obeying your instructions. Anyways, look, it's not me you're here to see this afternoon. It's really Joe, and I just want to thank Joe on your behalf, and indeed the Institute as well, for sharing his insights and his recent research in regard to the whole kind of, I suppose, field of AI, which is really exploding over the last 24 months, and particularly exponentially over the last 6 to 12 months. And Joe has just written a book and some good news about that. He's been kind enough to give us a material discount in regard to that. So we would be expecting kind of a spike in sales, Joe, after this one. And I'm sure Christmas stockings will be filled left, right, and center with the book. Actually, I got it. It's very good, I have to say, Joe, and the tips are very helpful. Um, at the end of the module, probably we'll have about 10 minutes for some Q&A, and just maybe hold them back until then if that's okay, so we can just get some kind of more punch from Joe in terms of sharing what he's going to share. The Institute is going from strength to strength, and we'll send you out some details in due course. But really, it's use of your time today in terms of effectiveness. And to that end, Joe, I respectfully hand over the watch to you and let you take the ship of state out. Thank
Love.
you once again.
I've just maximized that Zoom window to full screen for some reason. So let me just
We've
on.
all been having issues with
Oh,
Zoom this morning.
yeah. Yeah, it's got it. There we are. That's better. I can just see you now near the computer. That's much better. Right. I've got my chat window open. So if questions kind of come up into your head as we go through, feel free to put them there in the chat. And then, as Pat said, we could, if they're timely, we'll try and answer them as we go along. Otherwise, we can catch up at the end and stuff. So let me share my screen. Um, are you all seeing my
Yeah, that's good.
desktop? Lovely. And as is my wont with this type of a session these days, I've stopped using PowerPoint for training now. Certainly online training, I use Notion. So this is a web page, a persistent web page. So if you open your chat and click on the link that is now in your chat, that should, unless you're behind some corporate firewall or whatever, open up on your browser. So if you want to follow along, and all the links and things of things that we're going to talk about and stuff are in this document. Okay. As Pat said, I've been putting together a new series of books recently. The first one was 100 Ways AI Can Help Photographers, because I do a lot of training in photography. And then the next two are management consultants and project managers. And I contacted Pat a month or two ago and said, it might make an interesting session just to have a chat about this stuff. The reason I'm writing these books is that I'm doing training with institutions, companies, nonprofits on AI several times a week now. And a constant question that keeps coming through is that people kind of know now about ChatGPT and about Copilot and stuff. They're aware that these things are out there. But what they kind of are having more difficulty with is, well, what can I ask it to do? Yeah, it's almost like I don't know what the questions to ask are to get the most out of these tools. So it just occurred to me that, kind of a series of prompts spaced around different types of job, and then breaking those jobs down into, their main kind of different areas and stuff might be of use to some people. And, since I've put these first three out, they've been selling reasonably well all around the world. So there's obviously some kind of a grow out there for this kind of material. So I just really wanted to share this with you today and just see what you think, whether it's something that might be useful. And as I say, I've got another 15 or 20 books lined up in this series for different job roles. So that's the plan. So the one we're kind of really looking at today is this one, which is 100 Ways AI Can Help Management Consultants. If you're more in the project management space, there's the link to the project management one. which is, the same format as well. So what we're looking at today in the management consulting one, is the same kind of thing. And as I say, I've discounted this for this week because we're running this thing today.
Thanks, Joe.
It's clear, and I mean, management consulting is a knowledge profession. As a management consultant, you are called in because you've got knowledge that the client hasn't got, and they perceive that you can inform them. You can either perhaps skill them up and transfer that knowledge, or you can come in and do a job that they can't do because you have more information, more experience, more whatever. So definitely that's an opportunity. And AI offers us huge amount of opportunity in terms of knowledge gathering, in terms of knowledge synthesis, and also in terms of knowledge presentation, because probably more than we've ever had before, I think, we now have tools which can transform data, which can synthesize huge amounts of data, which can save us massive amounts of time in pulling data from many different sources together, and then putting that into different formats depending on what the audience, the client, wants. And we've never had it so good. It's almost too good. For a lot of people. I mean, I have this newsletter that I drop out every couple of weeks or so now on AI, and I thought it would just run for a half a dozen issues, and I think we just dropped 78 or something, issue 78 or something. I mean, it's just constant. It's almost like an onslaught, and every week there's new stuff coming out. And if you're not in the AI bubble, if you're not a nerd like me, you're aware that there's stuff happening. The odd thing hits your news feed or whatever. But unless you're actually reading the AI news feeds kind of every day, there's loads of stuff you miss that you're not up to date with the latest iterations of all the tools and the new tools that are coming out and stuff like that. So opportunities and threats. Yeah. So I mean, I just got Notion here to just give me some of the opportunities and the threats. I'm not going to talk through all of these right now, but there's ups and downs. We are threatened as a profession, the consultancy profession, perhaps in that it's never been as easy for anybody, non-consultants alike, as well as consultants, to pull information together. And maybe that was a differentiator that we had previously, that we knew how to assemble information and pull it from many different sources, that we had the ability to then collate that information and present it in a meaningful way. All the AIs can do that for you now. Now, can you make the AIs do that? That's another question. And that's kind of one of the things that the book is trying to help with, because what we're trying to do in the book is kind of give you prompts, is give you a series of here's a prompt, here's a question you can ask the GPT or the Claude or the Copilot or whatever that will elicit this kind of a document or this kind of a response and stuff like that. So it's really an ideas book, and then you can adjust the prompts obviously to suit your own situations and stuff like that. Other threats that we've got here. Clients are now becoming more aware that the AI can do a lot of this stuff. So perhaps the bar is rising slightly in terms of their expectations from us as consultants. And I say us because I act as a consultant as well. I mean, I'm a university professor, but I also consult with organizations and stuff like that. So, I'm definitely in the house here, and I have been for many years. So, we've got to think about this stuff. And there is a massive opportunity around implementing AI into organizations for any consultant. But The threat is if you are, as a consultant, aren't up to speed on AI, if you're not aware of the latest capabilities, the stuff that's coming down the track, and how to weave the AI tool sets into legacy systems and also the AI tools into each other to maximize. Because I mean, very often, when I'm doing more in-depth training with organizations and stuff, it's not just show them ChatGPT, show them Copilot, whatever. It's like, right, we're gonna start in Gemini and we'll jump over into ChatGPT, and then we might end up in Gamma, or we might end up in Notion or whatever. You assemble a tool set of these different products. So one of the things the book does, I've taken, I think, 10 of the top kind of free AIs for the management consulting book, and we've really just focused on those. So you don't have to spend a whole lot of money. I think you're going to get better results if you take out a professional subscription to, I mean, probably Copilot and Gemini. I think any consultant at the moment should be spending the €20 a month on both of those because you get a better model, you get better capabilities from them. You'll be able to demonstrate to your clients that you're on, Microsoft 365, the corporate version, so you can show them that you're in the sandbox and you're seeing the agents and all the stuff rather than just the free stuff. So there's more credibility, and it also, lets you demonstrate stuff that they will see in their own environments as well. So I think there's a minimum. Those two should be on your kind of subscription list every month. So what I've done is I've broken down management consulting into a number of areas. So hopefully you can see this on the screen. So, table of contents, glossary of tools. So business strategy and planning. So we've got 10 kind of things that AI can help with business strategy and planning. Market research, competitive analysis, operations and process, financial analysis, digital transformation and technology, risk, talent, marketing, mergers, acquisitions, sustainability, and ESG. Okay, so it's kind of broken down into the big pots of things that many consultancies are kind of facing, that clients want, from these different areas. Okay, and then within each of those, I've given you some prompts that can help to do that. Okay, and then so that's the table of contents. So now what I've done is I've just taken a few of these as an example. Okay, so here's number 14. Okay, so we've got trend forecasting via Perplexity using aggregator news summarization. Kind of sounds a bit complicated, doesn't it? Okay, so what's the purpose of doing this, and what would the benefits be? Okay, for you and for your clients and stuff. Okay, and then a kind of step-by-step of how to do it. Now, many of these tools, many of these prompts, rather than just opening the chatbot up and putting in the prompt, quite a number of these prompts will generate better results if you preload relevant information. It might be relevant client information about the client. It might be their website. It might be that you pull together an industry summary or whatever first, or whatever, or it might be some information about using client data and stuff like that. So again, you want to be on one of the paid versions, ideally, because the paid versions generally are not sharing data out into the wider world, and you don't want to be sharing sensitive data into the general training data set. So that's another benefit from using the paid versions. Okay, but all the AIs now can go off and do incredible types of research. So we have the prompts here in the top right-hand corner. Okay, so I've given you a couple of prompts and then a chain, because again, to get the most out of many of these AIs, it's not just what we call single shot prompting, just asking one question. You might ask a question and then do some follow-ups. You might ask a question that has 3 or 4 parts to the question. I mean, very often I'll put a whole paragraph in before I hit the enter key. And I get much more nuance and much more depth back from the AI tools when I do that. But these prompts are kind of designed that you can just kind of type that prompt in, and it should give you some good information back. But then obviously don't just be constrained by the words that I've got on the page there. Think about that in the context of your client and the information you've got and the information you're trying to elicit, and use it as a jumping off point. Just use it as a starting point and then adjust. But you're going to have 100 good ideas, and if you can't find something useful in the book, I'd be surprised. I sent it off to Pat. Pat, I think, was one of the first people that saw the book, when I did send it out. So I was kind of like, fingers crossed, is he going to come back and say, oh, this is a load of rubbish, Jerry?
I want you to know, Joe, that I have it under my pillow. I read it every night.
But when you went through it, Pat, you've got huge experience as a consultant, haven't you? I mean, did you see this as being practically useful as a kind of user
Yeah.
that you would open up next to the computer and kind of,
I'll tell you where I found it useful, Joe. There's so much information coming, and you're copying stuff and you're sending emails to remind yourself to read this and do that, and there is a blizzard of information coming and tips and tricks and hacks, for want of a better word.
yeah.
I found it really beneficial to actually go into another room without a computer in it and actually just read it and let it filtrate through and think about it. Because when you're on a laptop, there's so much stuff coming at you that you actually don't have time to actually process it and think about it. So I found it very helpful from that regard because I'm sure everyone is the same. There's just so much information and tips and tricks and hacks that you just get lost in the blizzard. So I found it really helpful just to actually step back, and I like reading anyways. So there you go.
Super. I'm just going to flick over into my browser. Una's just put a question in the chat there. Thanks, Una. So she hadn't heard of Perplexity. So Perplexity is one of the ones, fairly close to the top of my list of AI links here. Okay, and if you open up Perplexity, and just for Una, I'll put it in the chat as well. There we are, Una. So you can click on the link as well. Okay. So this is one of the AIs. So I mean, everybody's heard of ChatGPT. Gemini is Google's AI. We've got Claude from Anthropic. We've got Copilot, which is kind of Microsoft's AI. Yeah. And then we've got Perplexity. And I think, of the Western AIs, they're probably the top five.
What about ChatGPT?
Yeah, ChatGPT. Did I not say that as the first one? I think was that the first one? Not the first one, Pat. I'm not sure. Yeah, so ChatGPT, Gemini, Copilot, Claude, Perplexity. They
And
would say
DeepSeek?
no, no. Deep. I mean, it's a good AI. Okay, DeepSeek, Quen, Z.ai. There's 4 or 5 very good AIs coming out of the Far East, but you don't want to be using those with any sensitive
Yeah,
information because
yeah,
the Chinese government has, standard links into all the companies and routinely pulls data out of all those AIs.
yeah,
Okay?
yeah.
So, but if you just want to play with AI, and it's not sensitive data, yes, add Quen and DeepSeek and Zed and the others to that list. And some of those are in the book. Okay.
Okay.
And as we go through the book, and it says, try this with Perplexity or try this with Gemini or try this with, you can try it with any of the AIs. I mean, none of those prompts are AI specific, if you like. So whatever your favorite AI is, and some people, you might have paid for a subscription to Gemini or whatever. So that's going to be your go-to AI. Yeah. Or maybe your company's given you access to Copilot. So you kind of generally going to go to Copilot. Now, the one thing I would caution with Copilot, Microsoft have taken a strategic decision with Copilot to stay 3 to 6 months behind the bleeding edge. Okay. So all the fancy new stuff that you hear, buzzed about in the news and stuff from ChatGPT and from Claude and from Perplexity and whatever, Copilot will get those things, but they get them a little bit later. They take a little bit more time. Now, Microsoft is is a corporate house. That's where its user base is. So what they've decided is we're not interested in being bleeding edge and kind of, having all the problems of things not working quite well, or, people trying stuff and it putting out answers that it shouldn't and all that kind of stuff. So we're going to sit on stuff for a few months and integrate it into the corporate ecosystem of Copilot and then release these things. So if you want to be on the very bleeding edge, and with some clients and stuff, you kind of want to be ahead of the pack and you want to show them that you're right up front with what's available, you should probably be using ChatGPT and Gemini. Okay, because Copilot will not give you that bleeding edge, but Copilot is building up into a very, very solid kind of ecosystem of different AI tools as well. But Perplexity is one that I've used for a long, long time. Some of the benefits of Perplexity now, that to some extent, some of these differentiators have gone now. But one thing that Perplexity has always been good at, I don't know, let's just pick that prompt. It doesn't matter what the prompt is. But look, straight away, it's reviewing sources. So when it gives you an answer, and the answer is, similar to a lot of the other AIs and stuff, you get all the sources as well, and it's always given you all its sources. Whereas ChatGPT for a long time didn't give you sources. So you got a good answer, but like, is this a credible answer? If you wanted to check where the answers came from and stuff, you couldn't. But with Perplexity, here's the sources that it's used. Okay. And if you want to go and check and see, well, okay, what's this Bernard Marr? Okay, right, there we are. So you click on it and you've gone off to that source. So Perplexity is very strong at doing that. It's showing you the sources, it's showing you the images that it's pulled together and stuff like that. So I like Perplexity. And one of the other nice things about Perplexity in the settings is that you can choose which of the major AIs it uses to kind of power its searches. So if you prefer Gemini's, smarts or whatever, you can turn Gemini on behind the scenes, but Perplexity is kind of interface and on all the sourcing and stuff is still as it is. So you could use Gemini, or you could use Copilot or ChatGPT.
Now, Joe, just an interesting hot tip for the participants. I know that if they pay for a subscription to Perplexity at the moment with PayPal, they
Yeah.
get it was 12 months, it's 6 months free at the moment. So it's a great benefit to actually trial it with no pain, but just put in a reminder if you're not using it as much to close the subscription about a week beforehand. Don't get caught like me when I do
Yes.
these things.
Yeah, yeah, because that's the thing, isn't it? I mean, they're all subscription based now, and it's just so easy to forget that it's going out once a month or whatever.
Yeah.
I've moved most of mine to an annual subscription because you save kind of a couple of months as well. And don't forget that if you're just using this for business, it's a claimable expense as well.
Yeah.
So most of my AI subscriptions, I don't think I claim my ChatGPT subscription because the whole family use it, so that's the one that I treat as my household GPT. But every other subscription, and I probably spend about 200-300 euro a month on AI subscriptions now.
Want to be selling plenty of those books, Joe?
Well, yeah, but it drives business, and it also allows me to do all the training and stuff. So there we are. Yeah, and Ray has just pointed out that Perplexity is free if you're a Revolut Premium customer. So that's only €9 a month. So that's a cheap way in as well. Yeah, yeah, good point there, Ray. So yeah, there's lots of these little benefits. Okay, so that was Una's point. So so those prompts up there, I just kind of brought down here. Yeah. So let me give you an example. I was asked by Institute of Bankers a couple of semesters ago to create a course on responsible and ethical use of AI. Yeah. So if we took something like this, top stories of artificial intelligence and stuff, and we just amplified that a little bit. So summarize the top news stories from the past quarter. Yeah. Focus on the financial services industry. So one of the things you should do with any prompt is you should kind of tell it the question that you want answering, but then also give it other information like what role should it take? what's the intended audience for this information, if you like. Okay. And then, what are you trying to, what's your end goal when you use this information? So synthesize the stories into a practical primer on the topic surfaced for the senior leadership team of insurance companies in Dublin looking to implement AI to improve efficiencies and reduce costs. So that's a very kind of, management consultancy focused ask, isn't it, from it? So let's just jump back over into. I mean, we've got Perplexity open there. Let me just start a new credit. So I'm gonna pop that into Perplexity, and it can go off and think. And I'm also going to just open that up in Gemini, which got a huge upgrade this week. If you haven't been playing in Google Gemini for a while, they updated it to version 3 this week. So it's kind of gone up significantly in power. It's probably my favorite of the AIs right now. Okay, so that's Gemini, the same prompt. And then let's ask ChatGPT as well. Okay, so then there's ChatGPT, pop the same prompt in. We'll see what we get from each of them. And again, this is another tip. I very rarely, if I'm doing any kind of vaguely serious piece of work, I very rarely stay in one app. I will ask the question of 3 or 4 AIs because they all come at it in different ways. They're all trained in slightly different ways. And, maybe you've got one AI set up a certain way, because in the settings, you can go into the AIs and you can tweak them and say, act like, an educator, or act like a critic, or whatever. And that will directly affect the way that they respond. So now you've got 3 AIs working for you at one go. Okay, while you're perhaps getting on with other things. And a massive change in the last 6 months from the initial AI models, which were, LLMs. They were kind of like chatbot 3.5, ChatGPT 3.5 and stuff. They were large language models, but they basically just took your question and gave you an answer. What we've moved into now is a kind of new version of these chatbots, and they're now called reasoning models. So the reasoning model, if I just click on this little arrow, you can see what it was thinking as it went through and processed that question. Okay, and a lot of these models show the thing. I always open the thinking up like this. Okay, so that you can see what it's doing, and as it goes through, it shows the thinking. Let me just put that in again, and let me just show you that again. So if we ask that question again. Okay, so just a second. So it's kind of just processing it now. Look. So it tells you what it's kind of thinking as it's starting to do its research. Yeah. And I tell you what, this is really worth opening up and spending a bit of time in now and then, because I learn stuff about kind of search, patterns and how to kind of approach searching for information by looking at how the AIs are doing this. And sometimes it's really interesting to see where they're going and what the questions they're asking themselves, and then they go down another route, or they retrace their steps and try something different or whatever. And it's really, really interesting to see how they're doing stuff. So there we go. So we've got an answer now from Perplexity, which is just about a page, something like that, with a number of different sources that we can look at here. Okay. Another thing, Una, on Perplexity, particularly, so let's go back to the answer. Okay. One of the nice things about Perplexity is that you can change. So if we've got to start a new thread to change sources, right? You've got more options that you can use in Perplexity. So I do a lot of academic searches because, I'm kind of working as a professor at UCD. Okay. So I can turn off web searches and just say, I just want you to search academic papers for me. All right. Or maybe you want, you want some finance searches doing. And now it's going to really focus in on financial, SEC, Bloomberg, that kind of stuff. Yeah. You can link now most of the big AIs with other sources of information, some more than others. So, I've got Perplexity linked to my Gmail and my calendar. And I'm finding that increasingly useful because I can just ask Perplexity, I can say, I'm sure Pat Downs contacted me sometime in the last 6 months. Was there something I was supposed to send him? And it can go back through all my emails and yeah, 3 months ago you promised to send Pat that big brown envelope. Yeah, and you never got around to doing it. Yeah. um, so it's a really good way of accessing, information that was relatively difficult to mine previously, whether that's a calendar or whether that's your emails going back years and years, your Google Drive, your Dropbox, your Slack, if you're using Slack or something like that. All these things now can be added as data sources and then turned on or off in your searches. So if you haven't been in to the settings, a lot of people just use these tools and just type the stuff in. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
Memo
what
to
you need
self.
to do is you need to spend a little bit of time and have a look behind all these boxes and see what they do. So here we are. Here's how you choose your model. You see, so if you prefer to use, I mean, I know Pat does quite a lot of writing as well. Yeah. And if you're doing writing, then you want to be using probably Claude. Claude is the best writer of all
Mm.
the AIs. There's no doubt about it. Hands down, it's the best writer. Yeah. But if you want to do kind of pretty up to date deep research and stuff, then I would be looking at either GPT-5 or when they introduce it. I mean, it's only been out 3 days. That Gemini 3.3 is very, very powerful now. But then,
Now,
yeah,
Joe, just another hot tip for consultants on the call here. I would say that if inevitably most people are, if you're using AI in the creation of reports and so on, it's kind of gone to the stage where you need to flag somewhere in the report that you have used AI to populate elements of this report, but also caveat that it has been on, has gone through the prism of human eyes to fact check and so on. But there is that expectation, and we saw what happened with, a particular house out in Australia a while ago, and the pain that ensued, where they got caught on the hop. So I think come clean and just put your hands up. There's, everyone's using it, so there's an expectation almost that people are using it. But I think it's actually an enabler and a competitive advantage to be upfront about it and say, yeah, we are at the cutting edge here.
yeah, have a transparency statement at the top
Yeah.
of the report or whatever, and just
Well,
say,
at the back of the report, Joe,
yeah,
the back
or
in
at the
the
back of
annex.
the report or whatever, and just say, look, yeah, we use, we use Gemini and Claude or whatever.
Yeah.
But the report has been, fact checked and validated by our human consultants, if you like. And yeah, definitely. But this gives you access to all these different engines. And there's Grok, which is that's the one from Elon Musk, the X AI. Again, a very powerful AI. It's not very popular over here, very popular in the States, not so much over here. And then Kimi um, is one of the Chinese ones as well. They don't offer DeepSeek or Quen in Perplexity, but those are there. You can attach files, and you see we've got local files. I've got Google Drive and Dropbox connected to Perplexity as well, so they come up as well. So that means if you're routinely storing all your information in Dropbox or in a Google Drive, yeah, then if I turn off the web search from the sources, yeah, and I just say, right, I just want you to search and attach files from my Dropbox or whatever. You've got quite a lot of control over which sources of information are being used to gather data as well. The Gmail Perplexity search, is it private, Sean? Well, I don't know. It's only looking at your Gmail. It's not looking at mine. I'm on the paid version, so if I include my Gmail in the search, then it's not going to share that information out into Perplexity's training data because I'm on the pro plan. But if you're on the free plan, yeah, unless you actually specifically go into the settings and turn off data sharing, all of the free versions share data. And the one that's changed recently is Claude. Claude, for the first couple of years of its existence, kind of was the ethical AI, and we never share your data and stuff. And they've basically taken the money about 3 months ago, and they changed their settings. So if you're still using Claude thinking it doesn't share data, it now does. So you have to go in and turn that off in the settings. Okay, so that's something to think about. Okay. All righty. So we were looking at the different kind of answers that we got back. So that was the thinking. So here we are. Here's my kind of stuff from, this is Gemini. Okay. And you see it's picked up that it was for the senior leadership team and stuff like that. So it's almost kind of put a memo together for me already as a consultant. Here's some top stories from the last couple of quarters. Yeah. Gemini has completely changed its tone of voice in the last few months as well. And again, I've asked it to be conversational in my own settings. If you go into the back end settings for most of these tools now, yeah, there's somewhere. So here it's instructions for Gemini. Okay. So I've added stuff into this that I want it to know about. So here's all my links. Okay, there's my Houghton photography link, my Orchid profile, my LinkedIn, my Scholar Google profile, all the rest of it. Don't use a Wikipedia or Reddit for any references. That's a line every consultant should have in their settings. If you haven't got that in, go put that in today. Because if you look back at the training of the original AI models, which is still a large proportion of what they're referencing, around about 70% of the training data of the original GPTs was from Reddit and Wikipedia, and anybody can write anything in those. So it's not really credible information. Jackie's nodding her head there. Yeah. So you've got to, I'm trying to kind of restrict the AIs that I'm using to credible information as far as possible. I'm still going to fact check it. I'm still going to go back and check things, that come in, but hopefully it's not going to be from, crazy Wild West sites that could, can say anything and stuff like that. Okay. So there's lots and lots of stuff in here. Use active voice. Yeah. I want you inclusive and accessible language in UK English, stuff like that. This is a good one for consultants. Provide multiple perspectives or solutions, yeah, and offer different points of view where multiple ones exist. Okay. Now, if you overtly ask these questions in the settings, then this changes the way that the AI responds. You get better answers back. Okay, so you're kind of training it into how you want it. It's like if you hired an intern for a few months or whatever, the first few things they do would be okay, and you'd say, yeah, but we like it in this style, and we like this, more of that and less of that, and all the rest of it. And that's kind of what you're doing with the AIs. You're training them into your way of doing things, and stuff like that. Okay, and this is the Gemini instructions. You've got the same thing in Claude. You've got the same thing in ChatGPT. You've got the same thing in Copilot now. Another thing that came in 3 months ago to most of the AIs now is memory. Okay, and again, it's a setting that you need to probably go and switch on. If you have memory switched on, the AIs now remember old conversations. So you're not starting from scratch every time. Yeah. And that can be great because now, if you're using ChatGPT as your main AI regularly, day in, day out and stuff, you don't have to explain everything that you've been talking about for the last 3 weeks because you've been working on that big project. It remembers all the chats. Yeah. So it's becoming more like a study buddy or a research assistant, that becomes more useful the more you feed it, to be honest, and the more you engage with it over time. Um, so turn memory on, because otherwise it's a blank slate every time. And it's just learning what you want from nothing every single time. And these AIs can become incredibly powerful tools for us as they learn what we care about and what we want them to do and stuff like that. Because you always forget, I mean, if you have to type in to every prompt, use UK English, it gets tired very quickly. Yeah. And I hate it when the American spellings come up, and now I've got a job to go through and change all the S's, the Z's to S's and stuff like that. So these things make a difference. They do save time for you. Okay, so there we are. And again, I've put information in about myself as well, which I need to update. Yeah. I've now written 15 books, not 14 books. So every now and then you do have to come in and and update things as well, on those. Okay. Da 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 da. Number 52, compliance. I mean, it's not like the most exciting thing in the world, is it? But maybe that's I know, Jackie, I shouldn't be saying that. It's wonderful stuff. Yeah, but again, the AIs know all about GDPR. They know all about SOX. They know all about the European AI Act and stuff like that. And you can create things like checklists and stuff really, really quickly. Okay. So here we are. So giraffe, there's one of the prompts straight from the book. Okay, let's just take it as is. Yeah. Create a GDP compliance checklist for an online retailer. And let's see what did I say? Which one did I say? Was it going to be Copilot? All right, so let's go to Copilot. Now, Copilot comes in two flavors. There is the free version of Copilot, which looks like this. Okay, so you've got, the sidebar and stuff. So it's just Copilot. Or there is the corporate version of Copilot, which is Microsoft 365 Copilot. Okay, so that's m365.cloud.microsoft. The free version is copilot.microsoft.com. And you know that you're in the corporate version because you've got that little shield in the top right-hand corner. And once you see that, you're in a safe environment that isn't going to share your data. Okay, you're in the Microsoft security environment. Okay, but if you don't have that and you're in the free version, it will share your data. So you shouldn't really, as a consultant, be using the free version if you're using anything to do with a client. Okay, you should be on one of the paid versions. So this is the paid version. Okay, so let's just paste that prompt in. Draft me a GDPR compliance checklist. Okay. Right now, so it goes off and it's having a look and it's seeing what it can find, and it doesn't take too long, and it's also giving us sources as well now, which it never used to do before. So I've just clicked on that source, and here's where it's pulled it from. It's gone to GDPR advisor. Da, da, da. Okay, so it's giving us a checklist, and if you go back down, okay, it's giving us some links to other places where we can get some stuff. Yeah. One of the things that I put in my settings for all my AIs is always ask me 3 follow-up questions. And I find this really, really useful because sometimes it sparks something else and I can go down that rabbit hole and get more information or whatever. But what Copilot particularly is getting very good at is transforming data. So it normally at the end of a question or a response like this now offers you some stuff like this. So would you like this turned into a downloadable PDF or a visual flowchart? Yeah. Give me both the PDF and a flowchart. Let's see what it'll give us.
And Joe, one of to add a little bit to that final prompt, if you insert, ask me any questions that will enhance your response.
Yeah.
That supercharges it as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is working away on the right on those two. Okay. And now look, you see, do you want it as an editable Word version? Yeah, or an infographic and stuff like that. So it there we go. So there's a what's that? Is that a structured checklist? Yeah. And then we've got a PDF here. Let's I think you normally have to save it before you can open it. And then yeah. Now look at that. Yeah, pretty good, you know. Um,
Now, Joe, that's excellent. And conscious of time at this point, as we said,
okay.
we have people back in under the masthead to get them back.
Hmm.
We could talk about this all day, and I do note that you were brave enough to put in 100 practical use cases. But if I was to ask you your top three, or even your number one, for example.
I think, I mean, it absolutely depends on the job that you're doing. I mean, I haven't got one prompt, but I think the thing that I'm finding the most use now out of these tools is their transformation capabilities, is that I can assemble data. You know, I can do research, whether it's just initial question research or whether it's the deeper research that takes 10 or 15 minutes. But then when I've got that corpus of knowledge, I can now turn that into all kinds of things very quickly. I can turn
Yeah.
it into a slide deck. I can turn it into a handout PDF. I can turn it into a podcast or a video or whatever. And the AIs facilitate me doing this. Absolutely. Do I have a prompt library suitable for management consultants? Ray's just put it in. Yeah, this is it.
Juice points, Joe. Juice points. Very good.
So
Yeah.
that's it. Yeah.
I actually here's a tip for everyone that I use sometimes. If you go into Claude, for example, and you say, acting as a world-class management consultant, generate a prompt to instruct, X, Y, and Z, whatever it is. And it will generate a really, really good prompt that you can then put into any of the other GPTs. It's actually staggering what it'll come back with. So, okay,
Yeah.
let's try it here. Acting as a
World-class
world-class
consultant.
management consultant, yeah.
Yeah. Improve this prompt. That's another one.
Yeah,
Improve this prompt for me.
yeah,
Yeah.
perfect.
If you can spell prompt.
Well, it'll probably pick up your spelling error anyway, so
It probably would, yeah. Okay, now let's just see. So before it answers the question, what it's going to do is improve the prompt. And
yeah,
we're now going to get probably a page long,
yeah,
structured, detailed prompt.
incredible.
And it's like, you spent an hour thinking about the prompt. And then what you get back is much, much better. So it's kind of going off and it's doing some kind of thinking about what I've asked for.
Yeah.
Look.
You're getting a
Your
super.
prompt is too superficial for a compliance document that could expose a business up to fines. Okay. Da, 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 da. Right. So here's the improved prompt.
Uh,
Now look at this. Okay. So we can just copy now that prompt.
yeah,
Yeah. So we'll just take that prompt and we'll put it in. And now it'll go off and it'll give us
yeah,
a much more comprehensive.
yeah.
So
So that alone is actually can be game changing.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. So yeah. So look, I mean, I just hope these ideas might be of use. And I mean, to be honest, if one of those prompts saves you kind of half an hour of work, it's probably worth buying the book, isn't it?
Yeah. And folks, we put up a
Yeah.
link again in our LinkedIn profile. We're transitioning our website at the moment, so she's down. So we'll put it up on the LinkedIn profile. And
Yeah.
Joe,
And the
Garamila
link's
Market.
there. The link's there at the top of the page as well. So
Ah, perfect. Okay. It's we're all very much vested in this and learning. It's the cutting edge or the bleeding edge, as you would say yourself. Been an extraordinary lunchtime and learn. Has anyone any final questions before we release Joe back into the wild of UCD?
now I don't think there's any other ones in the chat, are there? No. Nobody seems to have fallen asleep, so that's good. Thank you all
No,
for
no,
coming.
I think, but Joe, I mean, for the consulting profession, it is a huge challenge
It
for
is.
sure. And we're seeing an evolution there. And, the fear for the junior practitioners is
Yeah.
that they're being carved out of that whole learning exercise. And we're, in conversations with some of the senior partners in the bigger practices, they're saying one of the issues they have now is, well, they recognize that they can, carve out warm bodies in a certain area. However, they're going to have a problem down the line when they're looking for partner material because these people won't have the scars on their back
Yeah.
of having learned the hard way, the old-fashioned way, and there's going to be a gap, and there's already a big gap, which is emigrated to Australia, but there's going to be a gap here in this area as well. So it's interesting, there's opportunities, but there's huge threats as well. And
Yeah.
what we're seeing, just as we close out on it, is people are going uber niche. That's
Yeah.
pretty much where we're seeing it going, and they're going almost submersible at this point, going really narrow in their area of excellence, and that's where we're seeing the evolution in terms of management consulting. Forgive me, I'll turn on my thing there. Okay, folks, Cur míle maith agat Cordi Galéir. We're going to close it out now because we did say to Joe we'd have him back for his 2 o'clock lecture, and I know all of you have your clients to get on with. So again, look forward to speaking to you again. I'm going to wish you an early happy Christmas, and don't shout at me at this stage because we mightn't be talking to you between now and then. But it's important to get in ahead of the herd. And as I say, always be closing. So support Joe, and feed the family and buy that book. All right, Slán go fóill. Good luck, everyone. Bye bye.
Thanks, everybody.